You've built your stronghold, conquered your enemies, expanded your tech tree, and tackled everything Haga Basin threw at you. And now, you want more. My name is Codiak, this is Legacy Gaming, and today we're teaching all you sleepers out there how to survive the perils of the deep desert. First things first, let's talk about how the deep desert works and what you really need to care about, taking into account the major changes that were revealed on June 23rd that'll eventually impact this part of the game. The deep desert consists of 81 total tiles, 9 grids horizontally by 9 grids vertically. These are arranged by letters A through I vertically and numbers 1 through 9 horizontally. At the inception of this system, A1 through A9 were static PvE zones that not only provided a location where players could build unraidable bases for all their deep desert operations, but these also contained various static Imperial testing stations and PvP-enabled shipwrecks. These points of interest don't change location each week, even with the Coriolis Storm, and each have a relatively fixed loot table that can have additional Imperial permits added or removed from their loot tables each week. Imperial testing stations in this stretch of the PvE zone have a 45-minute respawn timer on their Imperial permit chest, while shipwrecks have only a 20-minute respawn timer. Once you move past the A tiles, you enter a PvP free-for-all zone that takes up roughly 87% of the overall deep desert, and a tier that you'll find T6 resources like titanium and stravidium in denser clusters the further you move into the deep desert. Past the PvE zone, you'll also find much more challenging buried Imperial testing stations and shipwrecks that award Tier 6 Imperial permits, currently the strongest gear in the game. In particular, the testing stations often feature a different layout than players are used to, pitting you against multiple waves of tanky enemies in gauntlet-style encounters. Additionally, those same crash ships you found occasionally throughout Haga Basin also appear here, likewise scattered across the deep desert. Looting these by removing the 3 different panels will yield much rarer crafting components, as well as the chance for elusive Imperial permits. Finally, spice blooms in the deep desert come in 3 varieties. The small ones, which you encountered in Haga Basin, are denoted by a single explosion before the plume dissipates. With medium blooms, you'll often notice a constant purple stream coming from the location of the explosion. And for the large blooms, you'll find those inside of ring mouths, massive areas of spice that hold upwards of 250,000 spice at a time. Each location will be visited by sandworms based on the overall activity in the area, but the ringmouths are the only place where the grandfather worms will come up and eat the entire field if activity gets too intense. Now, this has changed as of the making of this video, making the PvE zone instead stretch all the way to the middle of row E. This has allowed PvE and PvP players to not only set up bases halfway through the desert, but also allowed players to find incredibly small pockets of titanium and stravidium with the occasional small spice bloom, and PvE buried testing stations. Past this point, most of the core ideas remain the same, with large deposits of T6 resources, ring mouths, and high-tier testing stations occupying the more condensed and hostile PvP zone. If you've never ventured into the deep desert before, there are a couple things we need to talk about in order to set you up for success, but more importantly, shield you from failure. The deep desert requires you to use an ornithopter because most of it, in its current form, is a barren desert where any form of ground traversal, short of leaping around with Bindu Sprint and your suspensor belt, will get you quickly eaten by a worm. If you've just built your first ornithopter, or it's the only one you have to your name, simply don't go into the deep desert. Losing your only advanced mode of transportation to even the slightest instance of PvP will not only set you back, but I can guarantee it will leave a bad taste in your mouth about the game overall. Every player in our guild knows that you don't go into the deep desert without a backup vehicle just in case things go south, and you should embrace that principle too. It's also about your mindset. You should go into the deep desert with the expectation that you'll lose what you're bringing in, because inevitably it'll happen at some point. To reach the deep desert, you first need to leave Haga Basin, and you can do that by flying to the extreme edge of the map and passing through the blue barrier. Once you're on the overland map, move northwest with your ornithopter until you reach the deep desert. Once you're on the map, you'll want to pick out an ideal base location in the PvE zone, but you might be wondering, if the deep desert wipes each week, why would I even bother to do this or care about where I place my base? Aside from the obvious of having a place to quickly store your loot, avoiding the tedious overland map during the week, everything you build in the deep desert costs half the amount of resources as it does in Haga Basin. This means, especially as a solo player, you can gain a significant tech edge doing most of your resource gathering and refining in this zone. Something like the large spice refinery, which costs a whopping 950 plastanium ingots and 1,000 spice melange, cost half of that here. Okay, that is a super endgame example, but the same principle applies to every crafting station leading up to this point. Being able to get better stations out earlier and utilize their reduced crafting and refining costs means you'll progress faster as your resources are utilized more efficiently. When building your PvE base, keep in mind that water is going to be a pain to manage unless you position your main location above something like a series of caves, outside a shipwreck, or even above a testing station if you are in a larger guild. This allows you to make use of the enemies that spawn there for your death stills. If you do this efficiently, water won't be a problem, and you can shift your sights on refining all the heavy resources here while transporting the refined items back home to Haga Basin before the Coriolis storm hits at the end of the week. I also want to point out that in the PvE zone, taxi services exist that allow you free transport back to any trade post in Haga Basin should you fall victim to the open sands. Don't put your base next to these things. Instead, you should be looking to utilize a craftable respawn beacon that you most likely haven't touched since you set foot in Haga Basin. Placing one of these near the taxi service, at your base, and even out in the deep desert on rocky terrain where you're farming allows you to get to where you need to go after a death. Given how vast the deep desert is, this is something you'll want to embrace and make a habit out of. If there's one thing you need to learn to master the deep desert, it's how to properly fly your Ornithopter. I know that sounds a bit ridiculous, but we have seen so many players get chased down by groups of other players that could have easily avoided their own demise if they understood a handful of tricks that allow you to push your Ornithopter to its limit. First, let's talk about how to properly glide. In the center of your screen, locked in place at all times, is a line with an upwards chevron. This indicates your horizon line, and based on how your Ornithopter is pitched, different things will happen to it. Placing the dot level with the line so your downward chevron completes a diamond shape will allow you to glide at max speed while only slightly losing altitude. Every tier of Ornithopter wings has a different max speed that they're capable of gliding at, and the lower tier you are, the more essential it is to maintain a maximum speed and altitude as you're fleeing from enemies. However, when performing this gliding technique, you do not want to be giving up too much altitude, and this is where the infinite glide technique comes in, allowing you to glide above world height threshold without using a single bit of fuel. This only works with the Scout Ornithopter, but for all you solo players out there, this can save you from constant attacks if you manage to gain altitude before your enemies reach you. Once you're gliding at 725 to 750 altitude, you'll want to pitch yourself slightly upwards so that the horizon line nestles between the ball joints of your wings. This will slightly drop your speed over time, but you'll gain consistent altitude in the process, and as soon as you see yourself dropping about 15 miles per second from your max speed, you can do less than a 1-second nosedive maneuver and immediately reset yourself back to this position. This will put you back at max speed, you'll barely lose any altitude, and keep you speeding away above the threshold that burns extra fuel. In this situation, most enemies won't be able to maintain their attacks on you, since they'll need to pitch up to hit you, lose altitude, and need to burn altitude and speed to get back up to the 750 altitude that you're flying before gliding again. If you master this flying technique before venturing into the PvP zone of the deep desert, you can avoid nearly any conflict so long as you're paying attention to the skies and getting airborne and altitude before players can collapse on you. I think it's also important to know that you should be carrying at least a full row of vehicle fuel cells on you at all times when in the deep desert. It seems like a lot, but there's a reason for the madness, and the reason is actually simple. If you're engaged in combat while in the deep desert, your goal should always be to gain the height advantage, even if that means burning an absurd amount of fuel to stay above players. You still have to watch your overheat meter, but this will allow you to keep putting fuel in until your opponent inevitably goes into a dive to cool their engines, because don't forget, any rockets they fire will place them well above the heat threshold. That's when you follow with a dive, but instead resort to the infinite glide technique and remain above 750 meters. If you do this correctly, you should be able to avoid about 99% of the fights on the open skies. Now that you are properly set with some of the best practices before entering the PvP areas of the deep desert, let's talk about how to dominate once you're actually, out there. I'll say this first before anything else. Do not bring anything you aren't willing to lose. This includes your Ornithopter, your armor and weapon durability, and whatever loose items are in your inventory. You should enter the deep desert with the assumption that you will not be leaving with anything and have replacement items back home that you can simply grab if you do end up dying. Trust me, this mindset will go a long way to actually understanding and thriving in the deep desert. This can also be said about your actual loadout when farming. When we go on solo farming runs, we don't usually carry more than a pair of soft step boots and a static compactor for spice or a cut array for ore. In either situation, you'll also want to keep 2 copies of both your chosen suspensor belt as well as a power pack to ensure you can remain agile and elusive on the ground. Finally, a simple decaliter john filled with water can keep you hydrated for hours. You should also embrace the vehicle backup tool. At the time of making this video, Scout Ornithopters, even with their proposed changes, are incredibly strong simply because if their inventories are empty, you can land in a pinch and immediately put your Ornithopter into your vehicle backup tool. Just make sure you are getting to a rocky outcropping and breaking line of sight for at least 2 to 3 seconds so you have enough time to get out and use the tool before a rocket inevitably hits you on the ground. If you maintain a minimal gear loadout as we described before, this also gives you ample inventory space to quickly evacuate your Thopter's inventory if you need to land, dump your resources, and store your vehicle. In our opinion, it's the reason why scouts with rocket pods will always be the dominant vehicle in the deep desert unless massive changes come to that vehicle, because currently it's the only one that is weapon capable that has next to zero risk of being lost because you can simply put it in your pocket. Even if you die after doing this, you'll just respawn with it safely in your tool. In our opinion, vehicles with weapons equipped shouldn't be storable in the backup tool, and with changes coming, who knows, that might happen. As far as active skills, when you're trying to survive an attack out on the open sands, after you ditch your Thopter, you'll want to use Shigawire Claw or Bindu Sprint. Either of these, when combined with your suspensor belt, will allow you to get away from nearly any threat from the air or on foot. Finally, let's talk about farming bases out in the PvP zone. If you understand how to properly build and make use of these in combination with our earlier tips, nearly any solo player can farm these PvP zones both safely and reliably. Just understand that whenever a sandstorm enters a sector where your base is built, your base becomes vulnerable, losing its shields for 5 minutes after the sandstorm has passed over your base. Knowing that, when building a farming base in the deep desert, there are 2 things to keep in mind. First, you'll want to be close to abundant resource clumps to cut down on travel time and risk, but at the same time, far enough away that you aren't one of the dozen or so prime target bases slapped right on top of a desirable resource. That means finding a covered area, a hole in a rocky outcropping, or underneath a well-hidden overhang to build a more hidden base. Reducing your visibility from the air goes a long way to keeping your base from being wiped out. Second, but arguably more important than visibility, is hiding your power generators and sub-thief consoles in not only different locations within your base, but behind as many walls or natural terrain blockers as possible. This is because whenever that sandstorm inevitably hits and your base is vulnerable, raiders are looking for 2 things. If they can destroy your generator, your shields will not come back up, and they'll have infinite time to raid your base. If they get to your sub-thief and destroy it, they can then place down their own, and suddenly all doors, chests, and crafting stations on that base immediately become theirs. You can do a lot of things to make your base a pain to raid. For instance, using triangle foundations instead of squares to dramatically increase the amount of walls a player will need to blow through. When using walls, use half walls and ceiling tiles to honeycomb your base vertically, making raiding from the top down even more inefficient. Also, make sure your base isn't being held up by only a handful of foundation blocks. If they take these out, the whole base goes with it. Lastly, keep a respawn beacon hidden well nearby, and don't keep loot in these bases long term. At the end of a farming session, you should aim to get everything back to your PvE zone base for safekeeping and crafting. It's much easier to die and respawn at your farming base with nothing but your vehicle backup tool, cutting down your risk by reducing the amount of time you'd otherwise be flying back and forth. Nothing triggers a raider more than spending time getting into a base only for it to have no reward for their time spent, or waiting for you to come back out at the edge of the zone when you simply respawned back out there. So there you have it, everything you need to know about the Deep Desert in Dune Awakening. Remember, things will change, as this is a live service game, and as the end game zone, the Deep Desert is likely to see the most volatility. But if you're serious about Dune Awakening and you want to know everything that's going on with the game, then keep it locked right here by dropping a like and subscribing. My name is Codiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.